What's up guys, let's get started. How can we reroll our items to have a higher chance at hitting that godly roll and save gold in the process? So starting right off, I'm sure a lot of you guys understand how the Occultist works. If not, what you're able to do is go to the Occultist and reroll a certain stat that you may not want. Now obviously you want the highest chance at getting the stat that you want, and how we do that is actually a pretty big brain play with this thing from Mobalytics. So what it allows us to do is see the exact rolls that we can potentially get on every single class. So what this means is if you want a big brain how to increase the chances of your roll on an item, you would actually play another class, go to the Occultist and reroll it on that class, because there are fewer chances to obviously get the stats that you don't want, because you have a less of a pool of things to actually roll on the item. So to explain this really quick, I'm going to use this ring to kind of give you an introduction and explain how this works. So for example, on the rings, ideally on rings you usually want to have your crit strike chance, you want crit strike damage, and on top of that you can get vulnerable damage. Those are like the three main high tier pro player stats that you want. And the last one, well, it's kind of up to you. Maximum life is obviously really good. You can get lucky hit chance if your build does need it, or some sort of bonus damage to either close or crowd control enemies, whatever the other stat would be. So if you happen to roll 3 really good stats and you want another stat that your class does not need, like for example on Rogue, I don't care about damage to frozen enemies. That's basically a worthless stat because I might not be able to apply freeze. Or if you're playing a sorceress, you might not be able to deal damage to burning enemies because your build simply does not do that. Or maybe chilled enemies, whatever the case may be, that's another worthless stat. So if it happens to roll it, and let's say you're like, well, the last stat I need on this ring, let's say the ring has crit strike damage, vulnerable damage, and then you also have maximum life. Okay, that's a pretty solid ring. And the fourth one rolls, let's say frozen enemies, and you're playing, let's say, a lightning sorceress or a fire sorceress. You don't need the frozen bonus damage, right? If I was to re-roll this on the sorceress, I could still not only hit that one, but I have all of these other things where it's like barrier generation I can hit. I don't want those. I specifically need to get that other last stat of whatever may be at the top. So at the top over here, these are the things that all classes can roll. And then over here where it shows the character class, it shows what other options you can have as a roll. In Barbarian, there's only 5 total options that can actually roll. So if I was to play Sorceress and I really needed to get that crit strike chance, okay, that was the last stat that I needed, I would swap to a Barbarian, because out of all of these rolls here, including these ones, it's a higher chance than playing on my Sorceress to actually have that roll. Keep in mind, just as a heads up, that if you are playing another character, like you make one that after you finish the campaign, you will have to either reach a certain level to actually reroll at the Occultist, or do a dungeon that allows you to access the Occultist, just as a quick heads up. But most of you guys probably have made several characters anyways at this point, but I just have to mention that, and I'll go over every single stat in terms of your pieces of gear, kind of what you are looking for. So starting right off, now that we kind of understand the introduction to this, let me go ahead and just kind of rapid fire this real fast in terms of information here. So starting right off, on the helmet category, this is gonna, by the way, apply for 99% of builds. Some people, they may not need cooldown reduction, but I'm going to go ahead and just go over what's the class that you want to swap to reroll to get the best stats on it. So for the helmet category over here, ideally you want cooldown reduction and life. If your build really needs plus ranks to whatever, like let's say I'm playing Rogue and my build, I need to have that poison imbuement, I would actually have to have the helmet roll poison imbuement, and then I would swap to a necromancer to reroll the last stat, because no matter what on necromancer, if I'm rerolling at the Occultist, I will never get the ranks to poison imbuement. So don't think that you have a better chance by swapping to another character, because that wouldn't make any sense. You need to make sure that it has that roll on the base before you reroll in order to swap to another character and get the last roll that you want. So basically on helmets you want cooldown reduction and life. And if you need the ranks of whatever skill, that has to drop on that character class, or you have to reroll it on that class. Otherwise, that simply will not be able to work. So to sum it up, you want cooldown reduction, you want life, and then if you want to get either of those stats, like let's say it has some sort of bonus to maximum energy and damage with dual weapons on Rogue, and it did not have cooldown reduction or life, then I would swap to Necromancer, because there's only 3 things that I can hit versus rolling it on Rogue while I've got 5 possible other options. So making the pool of options smaller. So on the helmet, you want to reroll on Necromancer. Next up on the chest piece. So ideally on the chest piece, you usually want to have life and several forms of damage reduction. This could be just flat damage reduction. This can also be damage reduction from close or distance enemies up here. And then the last stat, if you want main stat, it's still pretty good to get main stat, but ideally getting life can be the more tough one. And you actually want to reroll the chest piece on the sorceress because there's less options here. Next up, as far as the gloves go. So gloves are kind of special. You want the plus bonus to skills. Like let's say I'm playing Rogue, Twisting Blades. I want it to drop with plus 3 ranks of Twisting Blades. If it only drops to 2, ideally, by the way, we're all talking about level for the item power 725 or higher. That will give you the highest amount of attack speed, highest amount of crit strike chance, or whatever you need. If you want to go to plus 4, the item must drop with plus 3 and upgrade to rank 5 out of 5 will allow you to, of course, get that plus 4. So ideally it has to drop with plus 3. Let's say Twisting Blades, or if I'm playing Sorceress and I'm playing Ice Shards, I want it to drop with plus 3. That I cannot reroll by another class. But if it already has that, and then in addition to that, we want to have crit hit chance and attack speed. And then you can maybe go for a lucky hit if you want to. There's also restore like primary resource on lucky hit. That would be dependent on the class as well. So if it has those and you're just missing, let's say, attack speed or crit hit chance, because those are the 2 ones that you really want to have on the glove category, you ideally want to actually roll it on a barbarian. This one, it's not like a huge difference, but depending on the class that you play, this may matter quite a bit. And even just a small, getting rid of 2 options out of like, I don't know, what is it, like 20 options, it's still better, right? At the end of the day, you might as well get your highest roll, right? It's going to be the best way to have the best chance of getting your god roll. Now, amulets are kind of a special one over here. And the reason why amulets are special is because there are like, 10, 15 plus passives that can roll, and that's only going to roll on your class, right? Like all of these rolls would be garbage. Now, let's say I don't want any of these passives, okay? I only really want to hit cooldown reduction and movement speed. Those are the 2 important stats on an amulet that most people want. However, there's another stat that is very important on Amulet, and that is your resource cost reduction. Ideally, you actually get the item to roll with resource cost reduction and either one of cooldown reduction or movement speed. So it has to roll on your class because the Necromancer's resource cost reduction will say essence. The other one will say energy. They have their own special tag, so it cannot apply as a global. So ideally, it has to drop with cost reduction on your class, then either cooldown or movement speed. And then what you do want to swap to is a sorcerer to hit that last stat that you want. Now, Amulet can be kind of special because the thing is that if you do want the plus to other passive and you're like, you know what, I can just go ahead and reroll my character because there's so many other options that I would accept as the best in slot. Like if you drop an amulet that already has resource cost reduction, cooldown, and movement speed, and if you really wanted maybe a dodge chance or something, okay, let's say you really wanted that dodge chance, then okay, sure, you can swap to another class. Ideally, Sorceress has the less amount of pools in terms of things that can roll. So you would swap to Sorceress specifically to have a higher chance at getting one of these top stats. But for the most part, Amulet can be an exception. Just pretty much roll it on your class. Unless you get a godly Amulet and you really need, let's say, that dexterity or int. There's another thing that's actually very important that isn't listed here for the amulets in particular. Amulets in particular can roll with bonus to X stat. So I can get flat percentage of dexterity, and that can be very big for certain characters for breakpoints in terms of your Paragon board. So if you really need a massive amount, the category that will give you the highest one is the percent one on your amulet. But again, that's kind of like niche, like 1%, just a heads up. Next up in terms of our rings. Ideally, this is what you want to roll on your rings. You want vulnerable damage, crit hit damage, and crit chance. Ideally, the last stat, you can go for life. So if you want the highest chance, you actually want to roll on Barbarian, which we've talked about because that wasn't for our intro clip. But yeah, that's the highest chance. And if you want to get any resource, this is another one where you have to drop the bonus to resource. Like if you want bonus to energy, that will only drop on, let's say, Rogue, because that's part of that class. So keep that in mind as well as a bonus tip if you do need that. Now, in terms of the weapons over here, it really depends on the class because certain classes can't get certain weapons to be equipped, but this will show off the implicits on all of them. I'm going to really recommend you guys, because this is kind of niche, because you may need to play a very specific weapon type that has a different implicit. I'd really recommend you guys to watch my video that goes over how to increase your damage and defenses that was uploaded recently. This is a very, very important video. I'll link it down below. You guys can watch that video after. It will really, really help out. But as far as this goes, the one that has the least amount, obviously, is going to be Barbarian with only 3 possible rolls versus, let's say, If we're playing Rogue, we have chilled enemies, damage, dazed enemies, and you may not want any of these stats for a very specific build. So this one's a no-brainer on Barbarian is what you want, because it only has 3 possible rolls versus, again, Rogue is the worst to get some of these, and the Necromancer could be pretty bad because you have crit strike, or Druid could be bad because you have Earth, Werewolf, Lightning. There's like multiple other that crit strike damage bonuses, right? So yeah, Barbarian would be ideal in this category, and this is going to be great because you have a lot less. And most of the things in this category, by the way, things cannot roll twice with the exception of what's called like the implicit on the item. So as in, if it already rolls basically a godly stat and you're just missing, let's say, the core skill damage, yeah, that's a no-brainer. It's going to be easier to swap. Now, as far as the pants go, let's go over the pants. So mostly on pants, you want basically the same piece as your chest. You want life and then damage reduction to, you know, close and or distance, or flat, just straight up damage reduction. But maximum life is kind of the important stat. So which one would I roll on the pants? This one is actually going to be the Necromancer because you only have 5 versus some of these having 6+. It's a small one, but hey, any way to have a higher chance at the end of the day is still the highest chance. Now, as far as boots go, you want them to have movement speed as well as resource cost reduction. Usually those are the 2 most important stats. However, this is another one where it's kind of like the amulet. You need to roll that on your class. So if it already has resource cost reduction to your class, right, the rest of the stats on the boots are kind of weak. Ideally, all stats and then your class's main stat would be advantageous, but you could still roll all stats and your class's main stat on the item. It's not a big deal. So you really only need to get on the boots that resource cost reduction, and then you just roll movement speed. Now, just as a heads up, if you keep on rolling things, it does get quite pricey. So I ideally like to already have my boots have like really high movement speed before I even attempt to re-roll some of these stats, because it can get very pricey, especially because you want usually movement speed, you want it as the highest value, whereas like in terms of getting strength, dex, or even life, you're okay with like an 8 out of 10 roll or like a 9 out of 10 roll. But movement speed in particular, I would say just make sure the boots drop with that high stat plus the cost reduction, and then maybe you can go for another stat. But honestly, boots are kind of like a weaker stat in terms of like the itemization. You only really need like 2 stats on them, so you could just get them to drop. I wouldn't waste too much gold on re-rolling to get that 17.5% movement speed, which is like the maximum on the drop. Now, as far as the offhands, this one, obviously you have a Druid that has a lot less pools, so Druid would be the ideal one to actually swap to re-roll. It doesn't matter if you're playing the class and it can't use that specific like random offhand. For shields, well, Necromancer is the only class that at this moment, without the exception of maybe the next class that's coming out into the game, but I won't spoil that in this video. But this is the only class that uses the shield anyway, so it doesn't matter in terms of the rolls. But Necromancer has a lot more things that it can roll, so you can roll on to another class, but at the end of the day, the Necromancer at the moment is the only class I believe that can use this. And then shout out to Mobilytics for this awesome sheet. So now you guys know on what piece of gear to swap to in terms of every single class. But anyways, hopefully this video and guide helped you guys out. If it did, drop a like on it. If you're new here and do want to see more Diablo videos in the future, subscribe to the bell and check out the pinned comment to see even more Diablo content.